Since my garden is more or less an autopilot until my tomatoes finally start ripening here, I decided to go all self-important for a bit and vent what I consider to be my most against-the-grain gardening opinions. Obviously, none of the following should be taken as absolute truth, and there are always exceptions and caveats to everything. After all, what they say about opinions being akin to a certain unmentionable body part is definitely true, and mine are no exception, but that's not going to stop me from laying them all out there anyway. So, kicking off the list is it's okay to grow vegetables you don't like. Now, a common bit of advice bandied about by vegetable gardeners is don't grow vegetables you don't like. And for the most part, this is pretty decent advice. Why devote time, space, and resources to stuff you don't really want to eat? But the exception here is if you're a beginning gardener who really needs a win. Vegetable gardening has a bit of a steep learning curve to it, and it's very likely that a grower's first few seasons are going to suck a bit while they learn all the nuances that help their garden thrive. This can be really discouraging to the point of wanting to give the whole thing up. So planting some easy plants that are kind of hard to screw up, whether you like eating them or not, can be a real confidence booster to the struggling newbie. Now, exactly what veggies are easy will likely vary depending on region and climate, but here in the Sacramento Valley, zucchini, asparagus beans, and Armenian cucumber are pretty easy summer crops, while radishes, turnips, and Swiss chard pretty easily thrive over our winter. Ask around. Other gardeners in your area will probably be happy to share what their most forgiving crops are. And regardless of what you decide to grow, you'll probably need a decent supply of compost, and thankfully, Google how to compost, and you'll probably come away overwhelmed and intimidated with all the talk of things like carbon to nitrogen ratios, aerobic and anaerobic bacteria, hot piles, etc., etc. It all seems kind of convoluted. Now, you could make composting into a big production, or you could just let nature take its course and let it all rot down in a pile. Here are the two compost piles I have going on at the moment. This one here started as soil from the grow bags and containers I was using to grow potatoes over the winter. And what I've been doing is regularly mixing in kitchen scraps and garden waste into the soil and letting bacteria and soil fauna just kind of do their thing, enriching the mix in the process. Eventually, I will sift out any remaining large chunks of matter that haven't broken down and use this to top off my beds or fill containers. There's no strong odors associated with this process because, the soil kind of covers it all up. Now here we have a blend of used wood shavings from the bottom of our chicken pen and kitchen scraps. This has actually turned into a hot pile by accident and is currently running at a temp of about 126 degrees. I didn't pay any special attention to the ratio of browns to greens, aka high carbon to high nitrogen material. I just threw it all in this bin and let nature do its thing again. In a few months, this will be a dark brown to black mix of completely composted green matter and partially composted woody matter. Because there will still be a lot of intact wood shavings which can cause nitrogen tie-up if tilled into the soil, I use this stuff as a top dressing for my garden beds. Over time, soil fauna and rain work the fully composted stuff into the soil, while the intact wood acts as a mulch, and this brings me to my next point. A lot of vegetable gardeners take a dim view of wood mulch. They'll use it to suppress weeds on pathways and in ornamental gardens, but it's an absolute catastrophe if a wood chip so much as touches a vegetable garden, seeing as how wood mulch will rob all nitrogen from the soil as though it were armed with some kind of nitrogen-sucking death ray. Like most myths, there is a kernel of truth at the center of it. High carbon material like wood chips can tie up nitrogen for a while, as the bacteria adapted to decompose it require a source of nitrogen in order to do its job. Once the wood is fully decomposed, the bacteria die and release that nitrogen back into the soil, leaving behind some great decomposted organic matter, but that takes a lot of time. And this might sound like a real problem, but the nitrogen tie-up really only occurs at the point of contact between the wood and the soil. A lot of wood chips tilled into the soil might tie up enough nitrogen to cause a deficiency in plants, but a layer of wood mulch on top of a garden won't cause any real problems at all. And arguably, the benefits of wood mulch greatly outweigh the negatives. Not only is wood mulch great at locking in soil moisture, it almost certainly won't be contaminated with broadleaf herbicides like straw and hay often are. Certain persistent herbicides will absolutely ruin a garden for years. And all of these beds here were topped with the chicken mulch compost mentioned earlier. And not to brag, but these tomatoes are doing great. No signs of any kind of nitrogen deficiency. And interestingly, these extra tomatoes that I didn't really have room for here are planted in a bit of a dump consisting of soil blended in wood mulch and various organic scraps at different phases of decomposition. And they're doing way better than I expected, which might be due to the wood chips balancing out an excess of the partially composted green matter and chicken manure. The blend of chicken bedding and green matter seems to be working really well in my garden, and I'm going to miss it because here we're looking at my empty chicken pen and coop, having gone from 3 to 0 chickens over the last 2 months. And don't worry, we didn't put them in a stew, but things did go pretty sideways on the poultry front. I am planning a future video essay of sorts that will go into more detail on what happened and sort of my post-mortem analysis on the experience of keeping backyard chickens. But the short version is you're going to spend way more money on feed and supplies than you'll get back in eggs, even given the high prices of eggs over the last year or so. Here in Sacramento, city codes allow residents to keep a maximum of 3 birds, and that's just not enough for an economy of scale to kick in when it comes to egg production. Now, if someone loves the experience of keeping chickens and sees them as pets that produce the occasional omelet, awesome, good for you. I, however, grew up rural and considered chickens to be livestock kept for a specific purpose. I'll just never be able to see chickens as pets personally. I might try keeping poultry again at some point in the future if we ever have space for more birds and can let them free range a bit, but for now I'm kind of glad to have the space back, which will give me a spot for yet another raised garden bed, even though I know this sounds baffling coming from a guy whose entire garden consists of raised beds, but I really see them as a solution to a problem as opposed to a goal in and of themselves. Raised beds are expensive. I've found ways to build them over the years that are inexpensive when compared to, say, quality raised metal beds. But between the materials to build them and the cost of decent soil to fill them, raised beds greatly increase the cost of starting a garden. I really only have them because my natural soil is a pack of clay that hardens into what feels like a concrete slab over our long summers. The clay soil can be amended into something arable, but that's a very laborious process that takes a few seasons. If you have decent soil and you don't have any back issues that make stooping and crouching for long periods of time painful, you're far better off going with a good old-fashioned in-ground garden. Now, if your soil is decent, your tomatoes will grow just as well right out of the ground as they will from a raised bed. And speaking of tomatoes, I know years of marketing has us all convinced that vine-ripened tomatoes are divine flavor bombs bestowed upon us by arcane culinary gods, but I'll be damned if my pedestrian palate can tell the difference between a vine-ripened heirloom tomato and one I let ripen in my office. A tomato that has started to show a slight blush of color is called a breaker, and once it has reached this stage, ripening will continue on or off the vine. There are some very good reasons to pick tomatoes at this stage. First, you get ahead of pests. We humans like a perfectly ripe, juicy tomato, and so do all manner of birds, insects, rodents, and reptiles. It makes sense to me to get my tomatoes before the critters do. Second, tomatoes have a fairly narrow optimal ripening temperature range of 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Too far above or below that range, and ripening can significantly slow or even grind to a halt. In my region, it's almost never 70 to 75 degrees, no matter what the season is, and I can attest to the fact that when daytime temps start spending more time in the 90s and 100s, ripening slows to a near imperceptible crawl. Now, if I bring them indoors to optimal temps, they certainly ripen a lot faster. And if you're worried that picking breakers will result in tomatoes that taste like bland grocery store tomatoes, don't be. Supermarket tomatoes taste like garbage for 2 reasons. First, supermarket varieties were developed to survive transport, not necessarily to taste good. Second, Commercially produced tomatoes are typically harvested green before the breaker phase, and then forcibly ripened via the application of ethylene gas. Staying on the topic of tomatoes here, I've grown a number of paste tomato varieties over the years, the most recent being these Canestrino De Lucas, shown here, and I'm honestly hard-pressed to notice any appreciable flavor difference between them. Raw paste tomatoes all taste like vaguely tomato-flavored nothing, and once they're cooked down into a sauce or meal and blended with seasonings and other ingredients, I wouldn't be able to tell you if the tomatoes used were Romas, San Marzanos, or even generic red cherry tomatoes. When selecting a dedicated paste tomato, I recommend researching what varieties grow and produce best in your climate, as opposed to the perceived flavor nuances gourmands swear exist. In fact, you might not need to bother dealing with dedicated paste tomatoes at all, because the biggest reason dedicated paste tomatoes are preferred by canners and sauce makers is their low seed and moisture content, and their thick, fleshy walls. It's far easier to peel and core a dedicated paste tomato, like the Roma on the left, than the slicer on the right, and its lower moisture content means sauce made from the Roma will reduce down to the desired consistency a lot faster. Unfortunately, paste tomato varieties can be a real pain to grow, as they are particularly prone to the dreaded blossom end rot. I've more or less eliminated blossom end rot in my slicing and cherry tomatoes, but every year, no matter what I try, no matter what tricks I pull, I lose a not insignificant portion of my paste tomatoes to this condition. As a consequence, I often devote my paste tomatoes to canned whole, halved, or diced tomatoes, as well as salsa, while using slicers and cherries for pureed sauces. Now, ordinarily, getting the seeds out of slicing and cherry tomatoes would be a miserably tedious task, but last year I went and purchased a hand-cranked tomato strainer that makes short work of separating the seeds and skins from the juice and pulp. And I actually find the higher water content of cherry and slicing tomatoes to be a benefit when using the press, as they feed through the auger and sieve far easier than paste tomatoes, which often must be softened by freezing and thawing or pre-cooking before going through the strainer. I'm all about removing extra steps whenever possible myself here. And sauce made from slicers and cherries does take longer to cook down than sauce from paste varieties, but in my mind that's a small price to pay for not having to battle blossom end rot quite as much. And on to my final and most controversial point. For the longest time, I was firmly in the anti-synthetic fertilizer camp, and there are admittedly some drawbacks to these products. If overused or used incorrectly, they can cause nitrogen burn and result in a buildup of salts that over time can harm soil biology. Excessive runoff from synthetic fertilizers can result in water pollution, but honestly, so can any number of organic sources of nitrogen. Too much of anything is bad. What I'm finding is synthetic fertilizers, though, when used in moderation and in accordance with the label, can be a useful tool in some instances to give struggling plants the boost they need to start growing again. This tomato bed here has had a bit of a struggle this season, with a number of transplanted starts hitting a wall and stalling out. The readily available nutrients from a dose or two of Miracle Grow really help some of these plants recover to the point that they actually flowered and, as you can see, are fruiting. I will be sticking to homegrown compost and organic granular fertilizers as my workhorse plant foods, as these help build soil and are far less expensive per pound than the synthetics, but I will keep a small supply of the synthetic stuff on hand to rescue plants if need be. I'm really starting to view synthetic fertilizers more as medicine than as food. Use occasionally when needed in accordance with the label, that part's super important, and you should be all set. All right, that's the end of my soapbox rant for now, and until next time, let's hope it all doesn't die.